This is the Hacking Real Estate Podcast, episode 21.
I think the number one piece of advice that's been at least most helpful for me in my career is to think with a long-term lens and put in the work that others don't want to do over that long-term lens. So for example, like thinking about what's going to be great about one home versus another for 30 years from now, like a really good school district is not going to change in 30 years, and putting in the work. Like we talked about, like the first thing we look at is the grade schools, which everybody can do. It takes 30 seconds to do. The thing that kind of sets the differentiator apart is we then get on the phone with a lot of people in each one of those zip codes and figure out the perception. That's a lot of work, and very, very, very few people do that extra step, but it's also very easy to do. You just pick up the phone and start dialing. So long-term lens and then putting in the work to fulfill that long-term lens is been what's differentiated things for me.
Welcome to the Hacking Real Estate Podcast, where we dive into the stories of seasoned, hands-on, and tech-savvy real estate investors. We'll learn the strategies and tools they use to maximize returns and minimize hassle, all while navigating the rapidly changing real estate market. I'm your co-host, Brandon Hall, and managing partner of Hall CPA, and I'm sitting alongside my co-host, Vikas Gupta, CEO of Azebo. With our combined 15 years of experience in real estate investing and entrepreneurship, we're here to help you up your real estate game. Let's get hacking.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Hacking Real Estate Podcast. Today's guest is Sean O'Dowd. He is an entrepreneur and real estate investor. He built a consulting business in his early 20s and used all the profit to buy Class A single-family homes in elite school districts. He's now the general partner of Scholastic Capital, a real estate private equity firm focused on single-family homes in elite 10 out of 10 high school districts. Welcome to the show, Sean. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So in your own words, can you tell us about your real estate journey?
Yeah. So, it's actually interesting. So I'm in Chicago right now, suburbs of Chicago. I was actually born here, like 5 minutes away that direction, but I moved 22 times before I actually went to college. So that was actually like the start of my real estate career. Every, to call it 9 months or so, we were on the road looking for somewhere new to live. This just wasn't like down the street kind of moves. We were bouncing all over the country, bouncing international. And, dad was working, mom was super busy with a lot of the logistical aspects of the move. So my job from like honestly under 10 was to like work with the agents to help find the place for us to go rent or buy, whatever we were doing. So that was my intro. That was my intro to real estate. Took the whole like agent licensing course as soon as I could, was in New Jersey at the time. And it kind of sparked a love that never really stopped. And it was always really just a question of when, not if, would start investing in real estate and maybe even work in real estate full time.
Cool. And where are you today in real estate?
Where I am, so it's actually kind of a precipice and turning point for me right now. So I've been running the consulting business that you mentioned and been using basically the profits of that to buy real estate. I'm now transitioning, shutting down the consulting business and now raising a real estate fund, Scholastic Capital, the one you mentioned, and I'm full-time in real estate, which is kind of a really interesting journey that it's been. And 7 or 8 year old Sean, who's helping mom find a new house, would be kind of surprised about. That's a full-time job that someone can do.
Mm-hmm. And you're focused on a very particular set of criteria, right? 10 out of 10 school districts. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So, it's actually really interesting. When I first got started in real estate, first buying properties, I was relatively young. Me and my girlfriend at the time, now my wife, was like, hey, we should get started in real estate. If we pool our money together, we could do it. And at the time, we were new. We didn't really know a lot about what we were doing. And we were kind of obsessed with this idea of doors. And you want to have as many doors as you can. You want to have these multifamily properties, one roof, easier to manage, the whole 9 yards. So that's exactly what we did. We found a 7-unit property at a price we can afford it, which at the time was, I think, 150 grand we bought it for. So 7 units at 150 grand. This was not the nicest place in the world. And we were like, great, we're in, we're doing it. And we made exactly zero money. In fact, we were losing money pretty much every month because there was always something that broke or fixed, and tenants were staying in the property for 45 days before moving out. And it was just a total, complete mess. We didn't learn a lesson, and we did it again. We bought a 6-unit. This time it was 200 grand, but again, very, very similar story. So we did that for about a year and a half. We sold them both and kind of licked our wounds and said, hey, like this is not at all what we thought it was going to be. What went wrong? And so I'm a consultant. My wife is actually also a strategy consultant. So we really started thinking about it from that lens of, in consulting, there's a phrase that's used a lot called right to win, which is like, what is a company's right to win in a particular category? Like why does Coca-Cola have the right to win in the beverage category compared to Pepsi? And for us, we started thinking about it like, what can give our properties the right to win a tenant compared to any other property out there? Like, we're in the Chicago area, there's literally millions of housing units within an hour drive of me. Like, why does one have a better right to win than the other? And we were really focused on that concept, and we were kind of looking for different things that could be the right to win. And we realized the biggest one that we could think of was school district. And not just a good school district, but like absolutely elite, like the best school district in the Chicago area, no matter what, is always going to have a lot of interest from tenants to move to that area because they want their kids to go to that school. And what we found when we talk about these really elite school districts is they've always been elite. This is not like popped up recently. It's everybody knows the school. Everybody's gone to that school. It's the place to be. So we said, okay, let's do that. So we bought one home to kind of test it out. Our agents thought we were nuts. They're like, you can't buy rentals in this zip code. It doesn't work. But we're strategy consultants. So we built a model and we said, we think we can make it work. And that home blew our expectations out of the water. She said, okay, we'll do it again. And our agents were like, you're nuts. Like, don't do this. I got lucky last time. And that blew our model out of the water again. And then we just kept doing it. And we said, like, hey, we're onto something here with this right to win being a really elite high school district.
So right to win a given market heavily depends on how you're defining that market. So to make sure I understand, so your thesis is that the market is a broader geographic area, not just that school district, right? So your thesis is like, we're competing against a bunch of other rental properties, many of which are not in this school district, as opposed to you have a right to win against the house next door.
Correct. That's exactly right. We're defining like the zip code as having the right to win compared to all of the other zip codes, and sticking the Chicago example, the Chicago area.
Got it. And at least in where I live, in the greater Los Angeles area, there is a massive price differential between the same quality of house in a good school district versus in an average school district. So even with that price differential, are like the rents sufficiently higher such that you're overcoming that price differential? Or walk us through some of like the economics of rentals in those areas.
But the short answer is yes, like it can overcome that. And the reason why is we're basically talking about supply, demand, and balance. Like if you're talking about buying a home in a really great school district, there's supply. Like there'll probably any given point 30, 40, 50 homes on the market, depending on the size of the metro. But if we're talking about the rental market, like investors aren't buying in those zip codes because they're really expensive, those homes. They're buying to live in them themselves. It's not uncommon to see one rental home in the entire zip code on the market. So your price premium is certainly higher on the purchase, but the price premium is even higher in a comparison on the rental side of things. And that's why the math ends up working out. But we'll give a like super concrete example. Our most recent purchase was in one of these zip codes in the Chicago area. We bought the home for $520,000, and it's on a 3-year lease with annual rent escalators at $4,500 a month. So we round up the escalators, so they're rounded. So it's 45, 46, 47 for the rental payments. And it's a fantastic home, really high quality. It's a great place to live. And that's really the other key part of this thesis is the multi-year leases. Because there's no rental supply in these areas, tenants are like, oh my God, I'm so happy there's a home available. I didn't think I was going to live in the zip code. I didn't think I was going to be able to get my kid to go to this high school because I can't afford to buy here, which is what we hear really consistently. But because of that, and this is one of the things that really surprised us about this thesis when we first got into it, is tenants unanimously ask for multi-year leases because they don't want to risk going there for a year and then losing the home. So we can basically lock in a long-term lease. We can lock in no turn costs every year. And we can also lock in those annual rent escalators because we're signing them onto the 3-year lease from there.
Got it. So if I'm a tenant and I can pay that much for the rent for a $550,000 home, is the only reason I can't buy because I can't put the down payment down?
There's a variety of reasons that we've come across. So in one common tenant archetype is that hey, I have enough income from my day-to-day job. I'm a lawyer, software engineer. Those are the kinds of people we see who come to rent these homes, but I don't have enough capital for the actual down payment. That's actually, we'll call it the second largest archetype though. The largest archetype that we come across most frequently is the short-termer. It's somebody who says hey, I want to be in the zip code for 4 years for one kid or 6 years for two kids, 2 years apart for the kids to graduate school. But because I'm a doctor, lawyer, software engineer, I'm smart enough to do the buy versus rent analysis. And the break even on that for an expensive home is typically 7, 8, 9 years. And they're like, hey, I only want to be here just long enough for my kids to get the diploma from this high school. So it's shorter than the buy versus rent analysis. So they say, I'm just going to rent. There's a bunch of other archetypes that we do see. Those two are probably 70% of the total pie though.
Yeah. So that's really interesting. So the more successful you are in educating the world, presumably the smaller that first bucket gets, right? Because then I would just move out and keep the home and rent it out and be cash flow positive and go wherever I'm going.
Yeah, yes. Assuming you don't need the equity to sell the home to go buy the next one, yes.
Well, the world's a big place.
If you own rental units but don't want to pay for expensive software, check out Azebo, the smarter way to manage your rental properties. With Azebo, you can automate rent collection, find quality renters, simplify accounting and tax prep, get a bank account designed for real estate investors, and save on rental property insurance. All of these services are free through Azebo. Join thousands of real estate investors who trust Azebo to manage their rental business in one convenient platform. Sign up today at azebo.com/HRE. That's AZIBO.com/HRE.
So going back to right to win. So, right to win, we talked about geography. I mean, winning is also what are you winning? And so again, my assumption here, my hypothesis here is you're talking about I'm going to win a better tenant. Is that right?
It's from our perspective, yes. It's we win the better tenant, and from the tenant's perspective, that home has the right to win because it's the only one with the address that goes to the high school that they want their kids to go to.
So then, comparing that with your 6 and 7 unit property experiences, does it really come down to tenant quality, or were there other items with those? Other issues with those properties that led them to be, investments that didn't pay off?
There is. So the two biggest, there's a variety of different ones, but the two biggest that it comes down to is maintenance costs and management burden. So on the management burden side of things, we'll do that first because that's the easier one. Just leasing. If we're talking about a lower Class C property, you're going to be releasing that property quite frequently. Tenants are going to be coming in and out quite frequently. We're talking about a Class A unit that is on a 3-year lease and a highly desirable one at that. We rent these things in 48 hours when we put them on the market because it's the only game in town. And 3-year leases, it's 48 hours worth of effort every 3 years. So that the management burden is way lower. And then on the maintenance side of things, there's two big important components to this. On the first side is we're buying the home from an owner-occupant who took really good care of it because it's a really elite school district. They were protecting their own equity. We aren't buying it from a landlord that was kind of cutting corners or a management company that was cutting corners here and there. So we're buying into an asset that's in really great shape right off the bat. So that lowers our maintenance burden. And then number two on the maintenance burden side of things, and this is one of the things that really just blew our minds about this thesis. So out of our existing properties, 100% of our tenants have repainted the interior of the homes the color of their choosing. 2/3 of them have refinished cabinets, kitchen cabinets, and then 2/3 of them have swapped out at least half the light fixtures in the home. Because they're there for 3+ years, they're putting their own money into it. We didn't pay for any of that. We didn't know about it for most of those cases because they wanted to make the place nicer and theirs because it is truly theirs. They're there for at least 3, and in most cases, 2 3-year leases, so 6 years. Because of that, the maintenance side of things is actually relatively lower. Our tenants are 45 to 55-year-old Midwest dads who want to get the drill out. Like if we hear from a tenant for a maintenance request, it's something beyond the capabilities of a 45-year-old Midwest dad. It's something that you need a license for, electrician, a plumber, a roof, something like that. Anything, we'll call it minor, they take care of because they want to, because it's their fun weekend activity.
And they're probably calling you right away if something major happens. I was talking to someone else and he said, his tenant called him and said, hey, the washing machine's been leaking for a while and now the carpet's rotting. Can you fix it? I imagine your tenant is probably calling you the minute that they find the leak if they can't fix it themselves.
That's true. So we have a lot of data compared to some of the bigger single family home operators. We've got advisors to our fund who work or have worked at those places or have sold their portfolios to those places. And we get way fewer calls than they typically do. But our average ticket is a lot higher because when we do get the calls, to your point, it's immediate and it's an important thing that needs to get done.
So are you self-managing? It sounds like you are.
We are. So we have basically a management entity that takes care of these things at basically cost, because the standard property management firm wants to charge 7.5% to 10% for single family homes because they don't want single family homes. They want the 300 unit apartment complex. So it doesn't make economical sense to do that at 7.5% to 10% when we could manage them in-house at 3, 4, 5%.
And so do you have a staff or are you the staff? Are you the property manager?
So for existing portfolios, it was my wife and I. For the fund, so I've got a partner in the fund, another general partner, and then we'll build out a small team that can handle more properties per person because the management burden on lease is lower on both the management and or leasing and maintenance side.
Going back to your first two properties, it always surprises me when first experience not great, and then people get back into real estate and then they find some winners. But two experiences not great. Sort of like what kept you going?
It was honestly the moving so much. And like real estate is truly my passion. My wife calls it my scroll. I have a lot of searches saved on Zillow, and like for fun, my weekend activity with coffee is scroll Zillow. I go to open houses for fun. It was never going to be away from it for long. It was a question of I had kind of gone in blindly without really thinking through like a detailed thesis of like what's something that makes sense to be doing and protects capital rather than kind of taking a flyer on hey, like this sounds like an interesting idea where it just wasn't a good long-term thesis for us.
So what made you decide to start a fund as opposed to just continuing and going and buying additional properties under your own name?
I for the longest time I really didn't want to start a fund. I had heard podcasts from individuals who had gone down that path, and I was like, that's not something I want to do. I want to 100% own my properties. And what kind of happened was actually Twitter. So I started a Twitter account, years ago during COVID because I was working from home. I was kind of bored, and I just started posting about like what I was doing, both on the consulting side at the time and on the real estate side. And I started getting some inbound messages from people about like, hey, next time you buy one of these things, can I kick in some money? I was like, oh, wow, like that's cool. Like I wasn't expecting that at all. And I started getting more and more of those messages. So then I talked with a lawyer, a really fantastic lawyer who specializes in fund creation, and he creates a ton of these. And just to understand like what it would look like, does this make sense, that sort of thing. And we did our official legal sales call. He works for one of the really big law firms out there. He creates the fund docs for some of the big funds that you know the name of. And he circled back with me after we had our conversation. And he said, hey, like I see these all day long. I think this is one of the best theses I've seen. Can I join you as a partner and do this with you? And I was like, whoa, like that's really strong. That gave me a lot of confidence that like, hey, this is actually something that there's a there. If somebody who's seen a lot of these thinks there's a lot of credence. So fast forward 6+ months and a lot of conversations with him. He's actually my partner now at the fund. That conversation kind of helped give me a little credit, feel that there's credibility behind what we were doing. And one thing led to another, and here we are.
Got it. And with the fund, you had mentioned sort of potentially selling it to a larger fund down the road. Is that the plan? Is that hey, we're going to get to a minimum size and then sell it off and move on? Or is it, how are you thinking about? I guess this is like the private equity version of the the VC question of how are you thinking about exit opportunities, which is a question I personally hate, but now I'm putting it onto you.
Totally okay. Totally okay. So it's an interesting thing. We thought about it. Honestly, it goes back to the consulting question of like begin with the end in mind. So everything we buy is cash flow positive from day one. Like we're going to be sending distributions out to investors monthly, which is unique. Most do quarterly. We can do monthly because we've got the cash flow security of the 3-year leases. But investors are going to want their money back at some point. Their homes will appreciate. There's equity pay down from the note. Like investors are going to want that cash out. So some point between 10 and 15 years, we're assuming 12 for simplicity in the model, we're going to sell the properties. And the most likely buyer is a larger fund. But consulting begin with the end in mind. We've basically called up people we know at those larger funds and have said, hey, if we build this for you, give us the exact profile of what you would like. And they've all been super receptive to that because it's in their best interest to give us those metrics, because then we'll build the exact profile of homes and location they want. So we have like 17 different criteria now that we're running our homes against when we are underwriting to make sure that it's something that is one of the funds are going to want. So minimally 3 bedrooms, minimally 1.5 baths, preferably 2, minimum square footage count. There has to be a Costco within 5 miles, no high capacity power lines with the property, no double yellow lines on the roads, which is a really interesting one we never thought of. It's got to be a neighborhood. It's got to be slow driving area. Then the other really interesting that kind of came out from this is we were kind of thinking about, hey, like there's really good school districts everywhere. LA, for example, there's a lot in Connecticut, Greenwich, there's a bunch in New York, Scarsdale, there's a bunch of really good ones in Dallas, Highland Park, Florida. There's a lot of really good school districts everywhere. But the universal answer we actually got back from the funds was, we want these homes upper Midwest. And the reason why that they were getting back to us on this was climate and climate risk. And they were saying, hey, we're getting crushed on our insurance costs. And they were giving us specific numbers of home communities where they underwrote them at $1,000 a door in Florida. And now the home community, the BFR community is not finished and it's way higher costs. They're like, it's not sustainable. And they have really good close relationships with their insurance partners because their insurance partners, they're 30,000 plus homes with the insurance, like they matter. The insurance partners are kind of giving them the heads up like, hey, we're going to keep increasing your rates over the next 5 to 10 years. The funds were telling us like, hey, if this continues the way that the insurance guys are telling us, 5 to 10 years from now, your portfolio in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois might have the lowest insurance costs in the country and be the highest NOI portfolio as a result. If that's the case, the quote was like, hey, you can name your price, which is obviously hyperbole. But for the investor's sake, it makes the most sense to buy in really great school districts for the cash flow now, but in upper Midwest for the sale down the line.
Got it. Now my head is spinning with questions.
Hit me.
One, I really want that full list of criteria, but
I can give it to you. I'm happy to walk through it.
Yeah, no, I think that'd be really helpful. So you mentioned like 5 or 6. What's the rest on? Or, some of those make sense. The Costco one was interesting. The double lines was an interesting one without necessarily perhaps going down the full list. Like what else jumped out to you?
So there's a bunch of other ones. The no pools one was really interesting. We thought that would be a nice thing for the tenants, but non-starter was the way it was described.
Is the pool because of like insurance and maintenance or?
Exactly, because they're at such a scale that they look at and they go, if we have enough pools in the portfolio, there's going to be some sort of tragic health situation that happens at every year if we have too many pools in the portfolio. So that's a non-starter for them. Yeah, the WL line thing was my personal favorite out of all of them. There's a noise component. So there's actually it's called How Loud. It's a software that basically says how loud is each individual home for a variety of different noise factors. It's got to be quiet. Basically means no airplanes going over, coming in for landing, no big roads. There's a negative view from a location to a prison or a jail. It can't be within 5 miles of any penitentiary. There has to be the Costco within 5 miles. They would like a Starbucks within 1 mile. And then school score, anything below a 5 is just a non-starter for them. That's for another fund, it was a 3. That's not going to be an issue for us because it's 10 across the board. We've got a whole bunch of them. Minimum square footage, minimum year. I've got our whole underwriting sheet is actually right here. Yeah, that's most of them right there. The ones that we just ran through. Some were non-starter HOAs. Some do allow HOAs with very specific covenants. The whole HOA thing is a whole can of worms right there. No redistricting, especially if our school district is based on the thesis is school district based. There can't have been a redistrict in the past 10 years because then there'd be a redistrict risk. Related to that is no school choice. Also would be negative against the thesis as well.
Is there anything else you look at? So like, are you looking at potential for new supply? Are you looking at job and income growth? Are you looking at property tax or regulatory changes or rent control, or sort of like what else do you look at?
Yeah, so that's everything that's called like individual asset levels, how we think about it on the home level. On the zip code level, there's a lot that we look at. Right off the bat, like our first screen is the school scores. Like we don't look at anything that's a low score. So we use grade schools as like our first screen basically. We take everything upper Midwest that's above like we look at it at high school as the driver, but we also look at it as an aggregate. So we want the aggregate score at a minimum to be at 21 for us to even look at it, which was like aggregate being lower, middle, and high school. So 7 average across the board. We have now refined that up to a 24, so 8 average across the board. But once we have that's the data. Then there's a perception question, and perception is more important than the data because the school needs to be perceived to be highly elite. So that's a lot of phone calls, expert interviews type situations. That's on one of the school elements though. The next one that we look at, we have a data set that's awesome. We found it online that shows you the percent of graduating students that go to an Ivy League school or Ivy League equivalent. So Stanford, MIT is also included in that list. We have a minimum threshold on that. We want at least 1.5% of the graduating class to be going to one of those schools. Optimally higher. Some of our zip codes are a lot higher than that. On top of that, from there, we go specifically to the district as a whole and outside of the school concept. The single most important metric for us is owner occupancy rates. It's got to be at least 88% owner occupied because that means there's not a lot of rental supply. And that 12% of rent is almost always a like 1950s apartment building that was in the area, because the homeowners in these areas tend to be like the final boss of NIMBY, and they do not allow new construction apartment buildings in these areas at all. So owner occupancy rates, very important. Household income, very important. That kind of dictates what rent tenants can pay. No redistricting in the last 10 years, no school choice. And then there's a bunch of additional things that we look at from home and relationship to where it is in the actual zip code as well level. So there's a lot that kind of goes into it, and it's different cuts depending on cutting down to the zip codes that we look at, cutting it down then to the homes within those zip codes, and then once we're under contract in the homes, then there's a bunch of like final additional checks that we do, which happy to get into what that looks like. But there's a bunch of it, as you can imagine.
Yeah. So we're looking at the upper Midwest. You mentioned, NIMBY. I mean, how much are you paying attention to just things that are like going on in like Minneapolis, for example, which is starting to really relax constraints on development, at least relative to where they were 5 years ago? Like, are you tracking those trends? Are you factoring that into your equation?
We are factoring that in. So it's one of the ones that I didn't mention because it slipped my mind, but that's a very important thing for us. So you can look at the number of single family permits issued by year for any specific zip code, and we have a percentage threshold that we're looking at. If they're issuing more than 50 permits a year, we don't want to be in that area. And we also do not want to buy in a zip code that has a lot of vacant land, because that's just waiting for Lennar to build a BFR community, Pulte to build a BFR community, and for the supply demand imbalances in the area to be upset. The way we think of it is we solely want to be in zip codes with no buildable lots left. And what we found in the zip codes that we're in, those 50 single family homes are almost always someone buying an older home, knocking it down and putting a $3 million house up, that they're going to be there forever. If, to your point, if there's development, it'll absolutely upset the supply demand imbalance.
Yeah. I mean, I sort of, again, being in Los Angeles, there's a lot of constraints on development. There's also no land, but there's sort of like a burgeoning anti-NIMBY political movement. And I've been reading a lot about what's been happening in Minneapolis. So I'm sort of curious about how you're thinking about that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, the really good school districts are really awesome, and we want to help make them more accessible, which is literally what our homes are doing. But if I could wave a magic wand, like the policy way to do it would be to build more apartment buildings, but it's not feasible in these zip codes. I mean, I can give you here's an interesting stat. In almost every single one of our zip codes, there's a billionaire who calls it their primary residence. And they are, in most cases, are sending their kids to the local private school, or excuse me, the local public school. There's not a private school that makes sense to do because the public schools are higher ranked. And they have the money to donate to the mayoral candidate who says they're not going to do anything. And 10 grand in a mayoral election in a Midwest city is enough to kind of put the thumb on the scale. And for that reason, like in one of our zip codes, there was actually a townhome project. It was like a 12 unit townhome, and it was for sale townhomes. And it was like a 7-year process before the city kind of finally gave approval for it.
Oh, wow. So is billionaire in zip code one of your criteria?
It's something that we were not actively looking at, but it actually was something that kind of like kept coming up of like, oh, there's a billionaire in this one. And then we would look at the next zip code and be like, oh, funny enough, like there's one there too. So it's not a leading indicator we look for, but it's kind of an outcome of the kind of places that we're buying it's kind of the places that lead to a billionaire living there.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I want to come back to something you mentioned at the top of the podcast. You said, you were looking at homes, from the age of 10 or earlier. How has your criteria changed from a 10-year-old to where you are now?
It's a good question. I mean, so when I was at 10, I was thinking about like helping that family find the home, and it was like what's available and what can we get in, because we had to move fast. I think what's largely changed is 10-year-old Sean was really impressed with like the flashy stuff, like the newly remodeled home and the home that looks really good in the pictures. And what I've kind of evolved and changed from there is that a flashy, like nice looking home is not a competitive advantage. There's actually nothing super special about that. That flashy home that looks great now, 5 years from now, is going to have a lot of wear and tear on it. And that design is not going to be the new flashy design of 5 years from now. It's not a competitive advantage. Like it can change, and it will change, and it will become dated. And today I think about homes and real estate from what is a evergreen, inherent, not going to change no matter what competitive advantage to a piece of dirt. And for me, that's the school districts. And it's that piece of dirt will always send its residences or its tenants, its owners, whoever it is, to that high school district. And if you can put a nice home on that piece of dirt, then you're golden from there.
Great. Well, this has been fantastic. Also super information dense, and I would expect nothing less from a former consultant. So thank you so much. I think if you're game, we can go into our 3 final closing questions now. So question number 1, what is your favorite book? And it doesn't have to be real estate related.
Yep. My favorite book by far, it's kind of one that flies under the radar. It's called Hero of the Empire about Winston Churchill. It's about Churchill in his 20s and when he gets captured and imprisoned. But what I love about the book is like 22-year-old Winston Churchill was absolutely convinced his life destiny and goal was to be prime minister. And it's about how he was taking steps in what was literally going to be a 30+ year journey to go get there. And it's like the perfect encapsulation of like what happens with a long-term mindset. And if you think about a goal and kind of work to a goal for that end, it's a really eye-opening book, an eye-opening read every time you look at it. Exactly. That was when he was down in South Africa.
Yeah, cool. I'll have to check it out. I've only read, most of the stuff I've read about him is, World War II or post World War II. So that sounds like a great book.
Exactly. And which is that was the pinnacle. But this book is about like what he was doing to get to the pinnacle. And it's really fascinating when you realize, wow, like this was a 30-year journey that he knew he was going on, but he was really game for.
Cool. Question number 2, what is more important to you or most important to you investing in real estate, cash flow or appreciation?
Optionally both, but I view it as bird in hand versus like two in the bush. Like if you are buying something on day one where you know you're going to get cash flow and it's protected cash flow because it's a solid asset, then I'd take that cash flow. The appreciation bet is risky. There's one neighborhood in the Chicago area, for example, it's about 40 minutes away from where I am, that people have been saying is going to be like this booming, really strong appreciation bet for about 30 years. And it hasn't paid off yet, but people keep saying eventually it's going to, and its appreciation is two birds in the bush.
Great. Well, thank you for not hedging on that one. Our final question, any other pieces of advice for the audience that we didn't get a chance to touch on during the rest of the podcast?
So it'll tie in to the Churchill book. I think the number one piece of advice that's been at least most helpful for me in my career is to think with a long-term lens and put in the work that others don't want to do over that long-term lens. So for example, like thinking about like what's going to be great about one home versus another for 30 years from now, like a really good school district is not going to change in 30 years, and putting in the work. Like we talked about, like the first thing we look at is the grade schools, which everybody can do. It takes 30 seconds to do. The thing that kind of sets the differentiator apart is we then get on the phone with a lot of people in each one of those zip codes and figure out the perception. That's a lot of work, and very, very, very few people do that extra step, but it's also very easy to do. You just pick up the phone and start dialing. So long-term lens and then putting in the work to fulfill that long-term lens is then what's differentiated things for me.
Got it. Great. Well, thank you so much again. Before we let you go, where can the audience find you if they're interested in learning more about you, about the fund? Help them out.
Yeah, totally. So I'm pretty active on Twitter. I post a lot about what I'm doing and what I'm seeing on a day-to-day basis. So that's I think I'm Sean O'Dowd at Sean O'Dowd 15. I guess I'm the 15th Sean O'Dowd. I'm Sean Patrick O'Dowd. I'm about as Irish as you can get. So there's probably 14 others in Ireland somewhere. And then email, I'm Sean at scholasticcapital.com. This is the stuff I love. So I'm always happy to chat real estate if anyone wants to reach out and chat.
Great. Well, I think this was going to be a great episode. Thanks again, Sean.
I appreciate it. Thank you.